Happy Sunday, everybody. I'm sure your social media feeds, like mine, have been filled with people talking about the new Oppenheimer movie that's out, or I guess they're calling it Barbenheimer because of the Barbie movie coming out too, and people seeing both of them. So there's been a lot of, attention, obviously, given to Oppenheimer himself, but also the broader context of what his story relates to. I've not seen the film. Personally, going to wait for the VidAngel version. But Oppenheimer's story is quite interesting. And what I want to go over today is a little bit of the background, but get to this question of the moral calculus, or the moral question about dropping the atom bomb. And in particular, what a couple of church leaders at the time said about it. So that's where I'll land towards the end. I will say that I've got allergies really bad today, so for those of you watching, I apologize. There's going to be a bit of a sniffling. So Oppenheimer, he was he's called the father of the atomic bomb. He was a physicist, a nuclear physicist. He was really smart with quantum mechanics. And in 1942, he gets recruited to join what was called the Manhattan Project. And this was kind of a secretive operation to try and build a nuclear bomb. He gets appointed director of their lab in New Mexico, and he's tasked with developing the first nuclear weapons 4 years after the Germans started their own program. So it's kind of a race, against the Nazis. And Manhattan Project was super secret. It wasn't revealed until after the bombs were dropped. So this was all top secret stuff. And so Oppenheimer gets this group of physicists together. He called them the luminaries. These just brilliant physicists that he groups together. They build this whole massive thing in New Mexico, this big lab. In Los Alamos, it grew from just a few hundred people in 1943 all the way over to over 6,000 people 2 years later. So this became like a big enterprise. This became a big effort. And in July of 1945, so just 3 years after he was first recruited to join the Manhattan Project, they created what they called Trinity. Trinity was basically the test bomb, the first bomb. And they tested it in New Mexico. This was the test of the world's first nuclear weapon. So the test went well, and consequently 3 weeks later, the bombs get dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is August 6th and August 9th of 1945. So when Hiroshima happens, the August 6th bomb is dropped at the New Mexico facility where they were creating the whole bomb. Oppenheimer was seen during the celebration to be clasping his hands in the air like a prize fighter, right? Having won the match. And so he's clearly jubilant as a result of this news in Hiroshima. But 3 days later, another bomb is dropped in Nagasaki. And for his part, Oppenheimer believed that it was unnecessary. He believed that not only was it unnecessary, he believed that it was unjustified to drop that second bomb. And a couple months later, he gets a meeting with President Truman. And he approaches President Truman and he says, Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands. And so Truman, after this meeting, says to a colleague, he says, blood on his hands? Damn it, he doesn't have half as much blood on his hands as I have. You just don't go around belly aching about it. And so Truman later told his Secretary of State, I don't want to see that SOB in my office ever again. And so here's Oppenheimer, the father of the nuclear bomb, telling Truman, the president overseeing all this, he feels like he has blood on his hands. Truman basically says, I have way more than you do. I just don't think about it. Don't bellyache, don't complain, don't just bury it down, don't think about it. And so as a result of the bombs being dropped, tens and tens and tens of thousands of people are killed. The estimates are between about 130,000 and 226,000. As often happens in war, it's hard to have perfect records of this stuff. So we can just kind of round, if you will, and say a couple 100,000 people die. Most of them civilians. And that's important because the quotes that I'm going to share towards the end from these church leaders connect in large part to that fact that most of these people who died were civilians. Half the folks that died, it was immediate. And the other half, it was slowly over the next couple of months from like radiation sickness and burns and things like that. Anguishing, death. Several thousand Korean workers died. 12 U.S. Navy flyers who had been incarcerated in a jail in Hiroshima. They were among the dead as well. And so these targets, these two targets, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were chosen because they were large urban areas that also held military facilities. And so I want to spend a second going over just a few of the many justifications that people use to try and satiate their conscience and tell themselves that this was okay to do. Right? That's kind of the narrative in America, that it was necessary, that it was important, that it was worth it, that it was okay, whatever. And there's a few arguments that rise to the top. Well, first has to do with that selection of those locations, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you see a lot of people claiming that they were military targets. They were chosen for their strategic military, locations. And so Truman himself, the day that Nagasaki's bomb drops, he says, "The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in this first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians." Well, it's completely false. I mean, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, that was a military base, like truly a military base. That's where all the ships were, soldiers, right? That was a military base that was attacked. Hiroshima, by contrast, was a full-fledged city. It wasn't a military base. It was inhabited by about 300,000 people. And yes, the city had some buildings and facilities that were of a military nature, absolutely. But it was a full-on city that was nuked, not a military installation and only that. I mean, the Navy, the Air Force were in control of the Japanese waters. Whatever troops that were stationed in Hiroshima, had been basically neutralized. The military wasn't a threat. So to say that we dropped the bombs on these military targets to, try and, limit their military, whatever, like we'd already limited their military as a result of this. I mean, and interestingly, if Hiroshima was such an important strategic military location, enough to justify dropping a nuclear bomb on the city, there had been tons of air attacks in years prior, devastating air attacks on the Japanese islands. And Hiroshima was not on the list of top targets. There was a list of like the top 30 or so targets in Japan. Hiroshima wasn't even on the list because it didn't rise to the top. It wasn't a strategic military location. It was a civilian population with a small element of military. So it's preposterous to say that it was okay because, it was just military targets. Well, then we often hear that, dropping the bombs actually saved lives. I mean, this is a very utilitarian argument, right? It very much is the ends justify the means. And people say this because the plan was for the Allies, primarily the United States, to invade Japan. There was a planned invasion just a few months later, actually in December, and then an all-out invasion, in the following year. So these plans were already in place, and MacArthur is overseeing them, and they're getting ready to go invade. And so many officials begin claiming that invasion of Japan by the military would cost 1 million American lives. Which is crazy because that's like quadruple the number of all of the American soldiers that died in all theaters combined in the Second World War. To say that 1 million would die, it's just such a preposterous number that has no bearing in reality. To say that 4 times the number that died in all the Second World War would have died just, in this invasion in Japan. But you have these high-ranking people claim this. I take this much like when they all, high-ranking people all claimed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, right? This bogus, inflated, statistic or stat or fact or whatever, not quote unquote fact, claim that allowed them to pursue their desired military objectives. It was a lie. It was a total fabrication to say that 1 million people or 500,000, as some others said, would die. I mean, for his part, General MacArthur, who was overseeing the invasion force, and so he has like direct knowledge of the capacities and of his men, the terrain, the situations they're going to face. He said only 95,000 people would likely die. 95,000 of them would experience a casualty of some sort, and only a third of that number would actually die. So a lot of people would be, wounded significantly. But he was estimating around 35,000 people. Not even that, let's see, got to do my math, 31 or 32,000 people would die as a result of the invasion. A far cry from the million number that's thrown out. And what's crazy is that the War Department, as it was called at the time, they waited until 5 days before the bombing to even notify General MacArthur of what was going on. He's the commanding general of the U.S. Army forces in the Pacific. Didn't even know about the bomb until 5 days that it was before it was going to be dropped. And so, like, high school textbooks today just totally and uncritically repeat this nonsense that 1 million Americans would have died. And it just shows how history is written by the victors, and how this prevailing narrative is just proclaimed as truth unquestioningly and accepted as fact to show that what we did was right because we won. And 80% plus of Americans, as a result, now believe that this is the case, that dropping the bombs, while tragic, saved lives. It's made it so that 1 million of our boys would not have to die. I mean, it's just total nonsense. And it's a fabrication designed to facilitate the dropping of the bombs for broader political and strategic purposes that a lot of these people wanted. And it's just totally rubbish that, it's just, and again, it's the ends justify the means. Even if a bunch of people would have, a bunch of soldiers would have died, let's say 100,000 or 300,000 or whatever, even if true, that is not okay. That is not a valid moral reason to kill a couple 100,000 innocent civilians that have no more to do with the war than you or I do with all the wars that are happening right now. Okay, number 3, another argument that we often hear when it comes to this stuff is that the Japanese weren't going to surrender. We had to do this. We had to drop the bomb because they were just going to fight to the very last, man. They would not surrender. We had to do something, significant to make them drop to their knees and sue for peace. Right? I've heard this argument a lot, this notion that Japanese weren't going to surrender. Well, this is, again, a complete fabrication. Japanese leaders, civilian leaders, military leaders, including the emperor, were willing to surrender as early as May, months before the bombs are dropped. And the condition was they wanted the emperor to remain in place and not be subjected to war crimes, a trial for war crimes after the war. So Truman is advised of this fact in May. And why is this, right? Well, it's because the Japanese monarchy, one of the oldest, dating back to like the 600-something BC, and in Japan, the religion is such that the emperors are the direct descendants of this sun goddess. And so this idea that the emperors have this kind of deified, divine status. And so that was the condition, was, hey, no war crime trials, you got to leave the emperor alone, but we'll stop the war and shut everything down and everything. And this was seen as untenable by Truman because of something that FDR started. So FDR, he had a policy of unconditional surrender. And so Churchill and Stalin kind of went along with it. But this was FDR pushing this idea that has to be an unconditional surrender. Truman decides to adopt this same policy when he takes over from FDR. And every one of the advisors, everyone around the president is urging Truman to revise the policy on unconditional surrender in order to allow the Japanese to surrender and keep their emperor. It's like, hey, this thing that FDR decided, let's change it up. Let's make an exception. Let's tweak it. But Truman, decides that he wants to plow forward. He gives a proclamation July 26th. So this is like a week before the first bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. It again demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally, refused to allow the emperor to, continue, which is ludicrous because after the war, the emperor was allowed to continue. That happened anyways, and yet at the time they were so obstinate, refusing to allow this condition that was actually the condition that happened. And so they dropped the bombs supposedly because Japan would not surrender, even though they were willing to surrender as long as the emperor could stay in place, which is ultimately what actually happened. So the Japanese surrendered after the bombs, and the emperor stayed in power. The very thing that back in May, they were floating that idea. So the only thing that changed between May and August is that, a bunch of dudes, wanting to drop these bombs and flex their muscles or create some type of, legacy in history or whatever, got to do it. And they killed a whole bunch of innocent people. And what ultimately happened was the Japanese surrendered and the emperor stayed in place. The very thing that had been floated back in May. Okay, so there were several people at the time in important positions that strenuously objected to what was happening. One of them was General and future President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower is the individual from whom we get the quote, military-industrial complex, where in his position as president, he sees this whole industry popping up that desires war because that's good for their bottom line. So they lobby and they donate to politicians and they do all the things to try and foment war. So he gives this warning in his farewell speech to the American people. By the way, if you have not yet seen, I highly recommend a documentary called Why We Fight by Eugene Jarecki. And the whole documentary is actually built around Eisenhower's farewell speech. So it talks extensively about the military-industrial complex in modern America. Fascinating documentary, Why We Fight. So Eisenhower, here he is, still involved. At the time, he's in Germany. So here's this quote from Eisenhower. In 1945, Secretary of War Stimson visited my headquarters in Germany and informed me that our government was preparing to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. I was one of those who felt that there were a number of cogent reasons to question the wisdom of such an act. During his recitation of the relevant facts, I had been conscious of a feeling of depression, and so I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary. And second, because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. Here's Eisenhower, this decorated, high-ranking, well-known, well-respected military commander saying Japan was already defeated, they were already going to surrender, and this was not necessary to save American lives. He continues, concluding, it was my belief that Japan was, at that very moment, seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face. The secretary was deeply perturbed by my attitude, almost angrily refuting the reasons I gave for my quick conclusions. So then we go to General MacArthur. Here's the guy involved, responsible for overseeing the planned invasion of Japan. He says, this actually comes from his aide, Norman Cousins. Quote, MacArthur's views about the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were starkly different from what the general public supposed. When I asked General MacArthur about the decision to drop the bomb, I was surprised to learn he had not even been consulted. What, I asked, would his advice have been? He replied that he saw no military justification for the dropping of the bomb. The war might have ended weeks earlier, he said, if the United States had agreed, as it later did anyway, to the retention of the institution of the emperor. So here's MacArthur, responsible for invading Japan in a few months. He's planning this invasion, he sees, like Eisenhower way over in Germany, that the Japanese are already going to surrender. They just want to save some face. They just want to have the emperor, continue, which is what happened anyways. So let's not only save the American lives from the future invasion, but let's save all the Japanese lives from not dropping the atomic bomb. Well, no, because there were a number of people who wanted to plow forward and manufacture some circumstances that they felt would give them the ability to drop these bombs, flex their muscle, show, Russia that we mean business, and whatever their goals were, they were manufacturing circumstances that would enable them to have the opportunity. Because the reality of the situation was such that there was no justification, that anyone without this agenda could see that it was unnecessary. Admiral Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff, said that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make wars in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. And so terrible was this action, this killing of all these civilians, that the United States, now the occupying force in Japan, they censored reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They did not permit films or photographs of all the mutilated survivors and everything else. It was a total propaganda effort to deny the public the opportunity to see the consequences of these actions, to sanitize from their minds the actual effects of dropping these bombs, so as to then play up in their minds the morality of it, the necessity of it, the utilitarian nature of it, the fact that it saved 1 million American lives, all that propaganda designed to appease and satiate the consciousness of American voters, and as part of that, suppressing the reality, the facts, the photos coming out of Japan for people to actually see the effect of what was happening. Okay. So we talked about Oppenheimer, we talked about the bombs, we talked about Truman and as advisors and others deeply critical of what was happening and undermining this claim that it was necessary and helpful to save American lives or make Japan surrender, any of that kind of nonsense. Again, just like today, right? This stuff is happening again and again, where military leaders will fabricate things in order to anger Americans, incite them to war, and create the political pressure needed to support military intervention. Happens again and again and again. And here it happened with the dropping of these bombs. Total fabrications used to facilitate this, which leads us to J. Reuben Clark. And I know I try not to use initials, but when it's their first initial, it feels really weird to call him Reuben Clark. So J. Reuben Clark, okay? This guy, he's called into the first presidency in 1933, so about a decade prior. Never been a bishop, never been a stake president. The guy's a diplomat, an ambassador. He's got political connections. He's a good, teacher, very eloquent. So he's called into the first presidency. And fast forward, so August 1945, he's been in the first presidency and in this position for 12 years at this point. And in the October 1946 conference, General Conference, so about a year after these bombs were dropped, President Clark, J. Reuben Clark, stands up to deliver an address which tears in to the use of these bombs. And I'm going to quote a few paragraphs from his remarks. He said that as the crowning savagery of the war, we Americans wiped out hundreds of thousands of civilian population with the atom bomb in Japan. Few, if any, of the ordinary civilians being any more responsible for the war than were we. And perhaps most of them no more aiding Japan in the war than we were aiding America. Military men are now saying that the atom bomb was a mistake. It was more than that. It was a world tragedy. And the worst of this atomic bomb tragedy is not that not only did the people of the United States not rise up in protest against this savagery, Not only did it not shock us to read of this wholesale destruction of men, women, and children and cripples, but that it actually drew from the nation at large a general approval of this fiendish butchery. We in America are now deliberately searching out and developing the most savage, murderous means of exterminating peoples that Satan can plant in our minds. We do it not only shamelessly, but with a boast. God will not forgive us for this. If we are to avoid extermination, this is his last paragraph, or the last one I'm quoting. If we are to avoid extermination, if the world is not to be wiped out, we must find some way to curb the fiendish ingenuity of men who have apparently no fear of God, man, or the devil, and who are willing to plot and plan and invent instrumentalities that will wipe out all the flesh of the earth. And as one American citizen of 130 million, as 1 in 1 billion of the population of the world, I protest with all of the energy I possess against this fiendish activity. And as an American citizen, I call upon our government and its agencies to see that these unholy experimentations are stopped, and that somehow we get into the minds of our war-minded general staff and its satellites, and into the general staffs of all the world, a proper respect for human life. 2 years later, Clark said, I believe also in conference, he said, "Today we sit quietly with our consciences scarcely stricken when we contemplate Nagasaki and Hiroshima, where we introduced the use of the atom bomb." So he calls it fiendish butchery. He says, it didn't draw opposition from anyone. No one condemned it, hardly anyone basically. No one's conscience was pricked. Everyone just kind of went along with it, and worse, they applauded it. They cheered it. They bought into the propaganda. They implicitly believed the claims of Truman, saying, "Oh, we just targeted military installations, and oh, this was necessary to save our boys, and oh, Japan wouldn't surrender. I gave them this proclamation, warning them a week in advance, and it was their fault for not surrendering." And the American people just lapping this up, and members of the church, Christians, lapping it up, agreeing with it, right? Not renouncing war and proclaiming peace as we're commanded to, but instead cheering on what Clark called savagery and fiendish butchery. And so in today's textbooks, this behavior is kind of glorified. I mean, the lies of the state, the history written by the victors, is unquestioningly told to the rising generation. And so people believe the nonsense. But the nonsense isn't true. The truth is that this was a moral bankruptcy. To kill that many civilian people when the outcome of the war was surrender plus emperor in place, which is what they were offering months before, this was really only done so that Truman and his pals could flex their muscle, could achieve these desires that they wanted. Because it wasn't necessary, and many people at the time recognized it. John Widtsoe, actually 6 months prior to this, so he's in the Quorum of the 12, 6 months prior, he said that all this occurred in the midst of the madness of murder that we call World War II. The hearts of men were already bleeding from the wounds of long years of warfare. Now the new power seemed as an added, unspeakable horror that promised a new type of destruction so awful that the hearts of men failed them. The rising ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki appeared as burnt offerings to the incarnation of the world's evil. I'm going to read that last sentence again. The rising ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki appeared as burnt offerings to the incarnation of the world's evil. Burnt offerings on an altar of evil. It reminds me of Spencer Kimball when he, I think it was in the 70s, 71 maybe, he talked about the false gods we worship. Here, Widtsoe is talking in 46. So a few decades prior, Widtsoe is talking about that this fiendish butchery, this action of killing all these people was a burnt offering on this altar of evil. So now you got Kimball talking about how this military-industrial complex, this Caesar approach to dealing with enemies and people trying to attack you, that it is idolatry, right? He called military armaments and weapons and so forth gods of stone and steel. Said that they were the false gods that we worship. That when threatened with an enemy, he said, rather than becoming pro-kingdom of God and lifting a standard of peace, we become anti-enemy, perverting the Lord's true teachings of patriotism, which involve loving other people, including your enemies. Kimball directly challenged this Americana pro-military narrative built on fabrications meant to justify all of the atrocities committed by the military-industrial complex over the past decades. And Kimball pierced right through it. So in conclusion, there was this physicist, Hungarian, German-American named Leo Szilard. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but he's a physicist. He actually was the guy that discovered or conceived of the nuclear chain reaction back in 1933, so a decade before the Manhattan Project. He patents the idea in 1936, and in late 1939, he writes a letter, kind of ghostwrites a letter for Albert Einstein to sign, suggesting the creation of what became the Manhattan Project. So this guy, this physicist, Hungarian, German-American, brilliant guy, basically leverages Albert Einstein's name to tell the U.S. government, hey, you ought to start this project to build a nuclear bomb and beat the Germans. So fast forward 2.5 decades, we're now in 1960, and this same physicist that discovered the nuclear chain reaction and planted the seed that became the Manhattan Project and these atom bombs, he said, 1960, just before his death, he said that if the Germans had dropped atomic bombs on cities instead of us, we would have defined the dropping of atomic bombs on cities as a war crime. And we would have sentenced the Germans who were guilty of this crime to death at Nuremberg and hanged them. But the victors are the ones that get to write the narrative. They are the ones who get to shape history. They are the ones through government curriculum who teach the rising generation between fact and fiction and right and wrong when so much of it is completely manipulated and untrue. Because this guy, this physicist, is exactly right. I mean, the utter hypocrisy to do this, and of course, you get the George Bushes and the Mitt Romneys and others of the world who say, I'll never apologize for America, right? I've written about this in a couple of my books, but this like anti-apology position that a lot of the America people take. America can do no wrong. We are God's light in this earth, and we are the city on the hill, and we are Christian nation, and everything that we do is okay, even though everybody's corrupt and nothing is awesome. And so you get this sentiment where because we did it, it must be okay. And because my predecessors did it, because people years ago did it, surely these are Americans. They're God-fearing, faith-loving, patriotic Americans. So if they did this, then clearly there must have been a good reason for it. I'm sure it was hard. I'm sure it was a sacrifice. I'm sure it was whatever, right? But they had to do it because they're on Team America. And this tribalism infects our ability to have rational, critical thinking and hold people accountable even on our own team. There are very few journalists that I respect because so many of them are just hyper-partisan and tribal. But one of the very few is Glenn Greenwald. He's the journalist who shared the Edward Snowden leaks when they first came out. And then he went to The Intercept, and now he's doing his own thing on Rumble, and he was on Substack. So he's just kind of an independent journalist now. But what I appreciate about him, he's very much, he's like a gay, left, progressive type of guy. But he will call out Biden and all the Democrat cronies just as much, if not more so, than when, Trump and all the Republican so-called conservatives are in office. And so he's an equal opportunity critic trying, from my vantage point, to hold people accountable no matter what tribe they're in. And that is so rare because most people are tribal in nature. And when you're on Team America, you're not necessarily going to challenge your own team. You're not going to hold them accountable. right? Because they're like you and they look like you and speak the same language and, they're in your community and whatever. I mean, scripturally, right, in the Book of Mormon, it talks about the Gadianton robbers, and they were difficult to detect when they went among the people because they looked like them, and it was hard to sift them out, right? When they were all separate and clustered together, it was easy to see where they were and who they were. But when they were among the people, they were very hard to detect. So the utter hypocrisy for us to claim any sort of moral standing, not only for the dropping of the atomic bombs, but just in general, leadership and influence on the world, right? And we are the only country that has done this. I hesitate to even say we. I don't want to affiliate with these actions at all. The U.S. government is the only nation to have done this. And it was, like J. Reuben Clark said, fiendish butchery, killing around 200,000 civilians unnecessarily, because all the bogus reasons used to justify it are completely false. And the ultimate reason, which was compelling the surrender of Japan, Truman 1 week prior giving his proclamation demanding the surrender, when that very thing that they had been proposing since May is what came to pass anyways. So all of this was completely unnecessary. Of course, the military-industrial complex that was just emerging at the time, and during World War II, this whole industry, they love it. They want to be able to show what they can do. Now, today we've got drones and you've got those like freakish robotic dogs and all these. You got certainly chemical warfare. You got cyber warfare. Like, these guys always want to create new technologies, new tools of death and suffering to be able to sell it to the government and help fight even more wars. And so there are incentives in place, I think, that led to these decisions to drop these bombs that had nothing to do with necessity or morality or ethics or anything of the nature, because all of those things argued against the use of these bombs, but they were used anyways because this was predetermined, it was preconceived. Truman and his buddies wanted to do it, just like Bush and his buddies wanted to go to Iraq. 1 year prior to 9/11, the Project for the New American Century, which was this nonprofit of all these Bush cronies, who, I should say, people who later entered the Bush administration once he was elected and after 9/11, these guys a year prior to 9/11 were saying that, well, we need more military and more strength and we need America in more places, but it's probably not going to happen unless there's a new Pearl Harbor to galvanize and focus Americans on the need for military strength, abroad. 1 year later, they get a new Pearl Harbor in the form of 9/11. And all these guys go into the Bush administration, into upper positions of leadership, and now implement the very thing that they had long wanted, which was regime change in Iraq, destabilization of the Middle East, and American military intervention abroad. So it's premeditated. These guys foment and manufacture circumstances that lead to the outcomes that they want. And it was no different with Truman and the atomic bombs. So whatever Oppenheimer's part of the story is, which is, he's the inventor and the project manager, ultimately others would have figured it out. It's not that, but for Oppenheimer, none of this would have happened. He plays a central role, but ultimately he starts becoming critical of it. He tells Truman he's got blood on his hands. He becomes critical of the dropping of the second bomb. They revoke his security clearance. They say he's a communist because he had, commie sympathies. And only, much later in life does he start to come back into a little bit of favor. But Oppenheimer, in my mind, is just a casual player in the story who could have easily been replaced with any number of other physicists, ultimately, right? Truman and his cronies in the government, they're the ones who bear this blame. Because it's one thing to build the technology and invent new things and have it as a deterrent or, whatever. It's another thing to actually go use it and kill a bunch of innocent people. So looking at this decades later and the story now being reshared about Oppenheimer, to me, it's an opportunity for us as Latter-day Saints, as Christians who have been commanded to renounce war and proclaim peace, to highlight the dropping of the atomic bombs in the same light that Elder Widsoe did, talking about them being burnt offerings to the incarnation of the world's evil. Or as President Clark talked about, the savagery and fiendish butchery, calling out members of our church and Christians and Americans more broadly for not only not speaking out against the use of these bombs, but for cheering them on and buying into the propaganda. I think this is an opportunity for us to reflect not only on history and what happened, back in 1945, but what's happening today. Whether you want to talk about Ukraine and Russia and all the bogus propaganda being used to foment war and support the military-industrial complex and create even more conflict, right? And all the lies being told that people just continue believing again and again, right? Or we can go back to the war in Iraq or Libya or Yemen or Syria and Afghanistan and all these places. Again and again and again, it's the same thing. So those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it, and we keep repeating it. But we are commanded in Scripture to renounce this stuff and to proclaim peace. I've shared before that President Nelson, when he was apostle in the wake of 9/11, gave an amazing address. I think it was called Blessed Are the Peacemakers, and talked about the golden rule and that there's no exception for countries. It doesn't apply to just individuals, right? The golden rule is meant to be lived by nations as well. And yet there are many, many people, the Gadiantons of the modern world, who desire the conflict. They want the war. They want to manufacture the circumstances that will allow for all these things to take place. And we're the ones commanded to awake, to call these things out, to shake off the chains, to awake and arise, to not let these secret combinations get above us, to renounce war, to proclaim peace. And most of us, despite having these enlightened revelations and access to modern scripture on these topics, completely ignore them and buy into Caesar's dominant narrative. So it takes a lot, especially when things are unfolding in real time, to sift through the BS. I think that's why understanding history critically is important, so that you can see that these people lie again and again and again, and therefore have a ton of skepticism about what they're telling us today. And not buy into the popular narrative and be very skeptical of it and patient and waiting to see how things truly unfold, because time often reveals the truth. So if anything, I guess the challenge or the invitation for all of us right now is to not only learn, the true history of the atomic bombs and be on the right side of history in condemning their use as unnecessary and barbaric and immoral, but also to apply that same scrutiny and support for peace and renunciation of war today. We should be the world's strongest anti-war movement, but we're not. No wonder the DNC says that we're condemned, because we have not repented and remembered the new and everlasting covenant, because we're ignoring the revelations we've been given. Why would God give us more? Right? Why would we get access to more things when we've treated poorly the things that we've received or treated them lightly? So I get fired up on this topic because we're so awful at it as members of the church collectively. Like, just on the totally wrong side and buying into the war propaganda and falling hook, line, and sinker again and again, and ignoring leaders like this, right? And Kimball about the false gods we worship and just pushing them to the side. Oh, no, because the message, the pro-war message, is far more dominant, and we're far more seduced by it. I think that's tragic. I think we got to push back against it. I think there are ample opportunities too, with everything happening today and what will be happening in the future. I think we need to be on the right side of history. We got to be on the right side of the present conflicts. And if history is any lesson, the best position to be in is the opposite of whatever the government is claiming is true and necessary. General rule of thumb for life, sadly enough. See you guys next Sunday.